Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. The setting sun painted the Phoenix skyline in hues of orange and pink as Martin Drake adjusted his wig one last time in the rearview mirror. His heart raced with excitement and trepidation as he prepared to step out of his rental car, dressed in a sleek black cocktail dress and stiletto heels. This business trip to Arizona had presented the perfect opportunity to indulge in his secret passion for crossdressing, far from the prying eyes of his colleagues and family back home. Martin, or rather Martina, as he preferred to be called when dressed this way, took a deep breath and opened the car door. The warm desert air caressed his freshly shaved legs as he carefully maneuvered out of the vehicle, mindful not to snag his stockings on the rough upholstery. "You've got this, girl," he whispered to himself, straightening his posture and putting on his best feminine stride as he walked towards the hotel entrance. The lobby was mercifully quiet at this hour, with only a bored-looking receptionist manning the front desk. Martina strode past, heels clicking rhythmically on the polished marble floor. She felt a rush of exhilaration as she caught her reflection in a large, decorative mirror. The image of a confident, attractive woman stared back at her. Once inside the elevator, Martina allowed herself a small smile of triumph. She had made it this far without incident, and now the night was hers to enjoy. As the elevator ascended, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. What would his wife say if she knew? His business partners? But he quickly pushed those thoughts aside. This was his time, his moment to be true to himself. The elevator dinged, and Martina stepped out onto her floor. She fumbled in her purse for the keycard, hands shaking slightly with nervous energy. Once inside her room, she let out a long, contented sigh. The space was awash in the warm glow of the bedside lamps, creating an inviting atmosphere that put her at ease. Martina's eyes fell on the neat stack of men's clothing on the dresser, a stark reminder of the dual life she led. Next to it lay Martin's wallet, passport, and other identification. For a moment, she considered tucking them into her purse, but decided against it. She wouldn't be needing them tonight. After touching up her makeup and giving herself one last appraising look in the full-length mirror, Martina grabbed her purse and headed back out. The night was young, and the city beckoned. The hotel bar was dimly lit and surprisingly busy for a weeknight. Martina found an empty stool at the far end and perched herself carefully, crossing her legs in what she hoped was a ladylike manner. The bartender, a young man with carefully styled hair, approached with a warm smile. "What can I get for you, miss?" Martina felt a thrill at being addressed as Miss. She ordered a martini, her voice soft and slightly higher than usual. As she sipped her drink, she let her gaze wander around the room, drinking in the atmosphere and the curious glances from other patrons. A man in a well-tailored suit caught her eye and raised his glass in a silent toast. Martina felt her cheeks flush and quickly looked away, both flattered and terrified. This was all new territory for her, and she wasn't sure how to navigate these waters. As the night wore on and the alcohol loosened her inhibitions, Martina found herself chatting with a group of women celebrating a bachelorette party. They complimented her dress and asked for makeup tips, never once suspecting her secret. It was intoxicating, this feeling of acceptance and belonging. When last call was announced, Martina realized with a start that she had lost track of time. The bar was emptying quickly, and she knew she should head back to her room. But the night had been so perfect, so liberating, that she was reluctant to let it end. On impulse, she decided to take a drive through the city. The rental car's GPS would ensure she didn't get lost, and the idea of cruising through the streets of Phoenix as her true self was too tempting to resist. The city streets were nearly empty at this hour, streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. Martina rolled down the windows, letting the warm night air whip through her wig. She felt alive, truly alive, perhaps for the first time in her life. Lost in thought and the gentle hum of the engine, Martina didn't notice when she drifted slightly out of her lane. The sudden blare of a horn from a passing car startled her, causing her to overcorrect and swerve erratically. Blue and red lights flashed in her rearview mirror, accompanied by the short whoop of a police siren. Panic gripped Martina's chest as she pulled over to the side of the road. Her mind raced. She had no identification, no way to explain who she really was without revealing her deepest secret. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the interior of the car. Martina's hands trembled as she lowered the window.
"License and registration, please,"
came the gruff voice of the police officer. In that moment of sheer terror, Martina's mind went blank. Without thinking, she blurted out the first thing that came to her panicked brain, a string of gibberish that vaguely resembled Spanish, a language she had studied briefly in college. The officer's demeanor changed instantly. "Ma'am, do you speak English?" Martina shook her head frantically, continuing her improvised foreign babble. She gestured wildly, trying to convey confusion and distress. The officer spoke into his radio, calling for backup. Within minutes, another patrol car arrived on the scene. Martina watched in growing horror as the officers conferred, shooting suspicious glances her way. When they approached the car again, their stance was more aggressive. "Step out of the vehicle, please," one officer commanded, miming the action when Martina continued to feign incomprehension. As she was led to the patrol car, Martina's mind raced. How could she explain? What would happen when they discovered the truth? The consequences seemed to spiral endlessly before her. Loss of job, family, reputation. Everything she had worked so hard to build. The next few hours passed in a blur of confusion and fear. Martina was fingerprinted, photographed, and questioned through a translator. She maintained her charade of being a non-English speaker, terrified of the alternative. When no identification was found and her fingerprints didn't match any in the system, the authorities came to their own conclusions. Days turned into weeks as Martina was processed through the system. She was moved to a detention center, still presenting as a woman, still unable to reveal her true identity. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had longed to live as a woman, and now she was forced to do so in the most challenging circumstances imaginable. Fellow detainees shared their stories of crossing borders and seeking better lives. Martina listened, guilt gnawing at her insides. She didn't belong here, but neither did she belong in the life she had left behind. In a strange way, this limbo state felt like the most honest she had ever been. When the deportation order came through, Martina felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that this ordeal might finally end, dread at what awaited her across the border. As she boarded the bus that would take her to Mexico, she cast one last look at the Arizona landscape. How had a simple indulgence led to this? The border crossing was surreal. Martina stood in line with others being deported, clutching the few belongings she had been allowed to keep. The guards spoke rapidly in Spanish, and she nodded along, still committed to her role. As she stepped onto Mexican soil, Martina felt a strange sense of freedom. She was in a foreign land with no identity, no connections, but also no expectations. For the first time in her life, she could truly be whoever she wanted to be. The first few days were a struggle. With no money and no knowledge of the area, Martina relied on the kindness of strangers and her own wits to survive. She found shelter in a women's refuge, where her story, or the version she could tell without revealing the whole truth, earned her sympathy and support. Slowly, Martina began to build a life in this new world. She found work in a small cafe, her broken Spanish improving day by day. The owner, a kind-hearted woman named Rosa, took her under her wing, teaching her not just the language, but the customs and rhythms of life in this vibrant, chaotic city. As weeks turned into months, Martina's thoughts often turned to her old life. She wondered if anyone was looking for her, if her disappearance had caused a stir. Part of her longed to reach out, to explain, to return to the comfort and security she had known. But another part, a growing part, reveled in this new existence. Here she could be herself, or rather the self she had always longed to be. No one questioned her identity or her right to live as a woman. The friends she made accepted her without reservation, not knowing or caring about her past. One evening, as Martina sat at a small table outside the cafe, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues, she made a decision. It was time to reach out, to bridge the gap between her past and her present. She borrowed a pen and paper from Rosa and began to write. "Dear friends," she began, her hand shaking slightly as she formed the words. "By now you must have wondered what has become of Martin Drake. The truth is both simple and incredibly complex." Martina poured her heart out onto the pages, explaining her lifelong struggle with identity, the fateful night in Phoenix, and the bizarre series of events that had led her to this new life in Mexico. She described her fears, her joys, and her gradual acceptance of who she truly was. "I know this must come as a shock," she wrote towards the end of the letter.
"And I understand if you can't accept or understand my choices. But I want you to know that despite the hardships, I have found a peace here that I never knew before. For the first time in my life, I feel truly alive." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "I don't know what the future holds. Part of me longs to return, to see you all again, but I'm afraid of judgment, of losing this newfound freedom. If you can find it in your hearts to accept me as I am, to help me navigate this complex situation, I would be eternally grateful. But if not, please know that I am safe and, in my own way, happy."
Martina signed the letter with both names, Martin and Martina, a bridge between her past and her present. She sealed it in an envelope and, with Rosa's help, sent it on its way to her old address back in the States. As she watched the letter disappear into the mailbox, Martina felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Whatever happened next, she had taken the first step towards reconciling her two worlds. She turned and walked back towards the cafe, her heels clicking on the cobblestones, ready to face whatever the future might bring. The weeks that followed were filled with a mixture of anxiety and hope. Every day, Martina would check for a response, her heart racing whenever she saw the mail carrier approach. But as days turned into weeks with no reply, she began to lose hope. Had the letter even reached its destination? Or worse, had her friends and family read it and decided to cut all ties? The uncertainty gnawed at her, threatening to unravel the sense of peace she had found in her new life. One particularly busy afternoon at the cafe, Martina was so engrossed in her work that she almost missed the commotion at the entrance. It wasn't until she heard a familiar voice that she froze, nearly dropping the tray of coffee cups she was carrying. "Martin, is that really you?" She turned slowly, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of her old friend and business partner David standing in the doorway. He looked travel-worn and slightly bewildered, his gaze fixed on Martina with a mixture of shock and relief. The cafe fell silent as everyone turned to watch the unfolding drama. Martina felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and fear. This was the moment she had both longed for and dreaded, the collision of her two worlds. "David," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. I can explain." David took a step forward, his expression softening. "Your letter," he said. "We got it. It took some time to track you down, but we couldn't just leave you here." Tears welled up in Martina's eyes as the implications of his words sank in. They had come for her. They hadn't abandoned her. Rosa appeared at her side, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Está todo bien, Martina?" she asked, eyeing David suspiciously. Martina nodded, wiping her eyes. "Sí, Rosa. He's a friend from before." The next few hours were a blur of explanations and emotions. David listened patiently as Martina filled in the gaps of her story, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief at the series of events that had led to this moment. "We were worried sick," he said when she had finished. "When you didn't show up for the meeting in Phoenix, we thought something terrible had happened.
We filed missing persons reports, hired private investigators, but it was like you had vanished into thin air. Martina felt a pang of guilt at the worry she had caused. "I'm so sorry," she said softly.
"I never meant for any of this to happen." David reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "The important thing is that you're safe. And Martina, we want you to come home." The word home sent a conflicting wave of emotions through Martina. Home was where she had felt trapped, unable to be her true self. But it was also where her family, her friends, her entire life was. "I don't know if I can," she admitted. "Things are different now. I'm different." David nodded understandingly.
"We know. Your letter, it opened our eyes to a lot of things. It wasn't easy for everyone to accept at first, but we've had time to process it. We want to support you, whatever you decide."
As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cafe, Martina found herself at a crossroads. The life she had built here in Mexico was real and valuable, filled with people who had accepted her without question. But the pull of her old life, the chance to reconcile with her past and move forward openly and honestly, was strong.
"What about the legal issues?" she asked, suddenly remembering the circumstances of her deportation. David grinned. "That's where things get interesting. Turns out mistakenly deporting a U.S. citizen is a big deal. We've got a team of lawyers working on it. It's going to take some time to sort out, but they're confident we can clear everything up." As the reality of the situation sank in, Martina felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps she didn't have to choose between her two lives. Perhaps there was a way to bridge them, to create a new life that honored both her past and her present. "I need some time," she said finally. "To think, to say goodbye if I decide to go back." David nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Of course, I'll be in town for a few days. Whatever you decide, we're here for you." As David left the cafe, promising to return the next day, Martina turned to find Rosa watching her with a mixture of sadness and pride. "So you're leaving us?" the older woman asked, her voice tinged with emotion. Martina shook her head. "I don't know yet, but Rosa, I want you to know that no matter what happens, you and everyone here will always be a part of me. You gave me a home when I had nothing." Rosa pulled her into a tight embrace. "Mi querida, you have always had a home in your heart. We just helped you find it." That night, as Martina lay in bed in her tiny apartment, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The fear and confusion of those first days in Mexico seemed like a lifetime ago. She had found strength she never knew she possessed, built relationships that transcended language and culture, and most importantly, had finally embraced her true self. The thought of returning to her old life was both thrilling and terrifying. Would she be able to maintain the confidence and self-assurance she had found here? Would her family and colleagues truly be able to accept her as Martina? As dawn broke, casting a soft glow through her window, Martina made her decision. She would go back, but not as the person she had been. She would return as her authentic self, bridging her two worlds and facing whatever challenges lay ahead with the strength and resilience she had discovered in herself. Over the next few days, Martina prepared for her departure. She said tearful goodbyes to the friends she had made, promising to stay in touch and to visit. Rosa presented her with a small silver pendant, a gift to remember them by and a reminder of the strength she had found. On the day of her departure, the entire staff of the cafe gathered to see her off. There were tears and laughter, hugs and words of encouragement. As Martina climbed into the taxi that would take her to the airport, she felt a sense of closure. This chapter of her life was ending, but the lessons and experiences would stay with her forever. At the airport, David was waiting with her documents, her old passport and a temporary identity card that would allow her to re-enter the United States. As they went through security and boarded the plane, Martina felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. As the plane took off, she looked out the window at the sprawling city below.
the place that had been her unexpected home and the birthplace of her true self. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she smiled through them. Whatever lay ahead, she was ready to face it as Martina, confident, resilient, and finally, truly herself. The flight home was a whirlwind of emotions for Martina. As the plane soared above the clouds, she found herself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. The businesswoman who had nervously dressed up in a Phoenix hotel room seemed like a different person altogether, someone from a past life. Beside her, David dozed peacefully, the strain of the past months evident in the lines on his face. Martina felt a surge of gratitude for his unwavering support and the efforts he and others had made to find her and bring her home. As the plane began its descent into their home city, Martina's anxiety peaked. What would await her on the ground? How would her family react to seeing her as Martina for the first time? The questions swirled in her mind, threatening to overwhelm her. David sensed her unease and placed a comforting hand on her arm. "It's going to be okay," he said softly. "Remember, you're not alone in this." Martina nodded, drawing strength from his words and the inner resolve she had cultivated during her time in Mexico. She was no longer the person who fled from challenges. She was someone who faced them head-on. As they exited the plane and made their way through the airport, Martina felt as though she were walking in a dream. The familiar sights and sounds of home washed over her, at once comforting and disorienting. And then, as they rounded the corner into the arrivals area, she saw them. Her wife, her children, her parents, all holding a large banner that read, "Welcome home, Martina." For a moment, Martina froze, overwhelmed by the sight. But then her youngest daughter broke away from the group, running towards her with open arms. "Mom!" she cried, wrapping her arms around Martina's waist. The simple word, "Mom," broke the dam of emotions Martina had been holding back. She knelt down, hugging her daughter tightly as tears streamed down her face. One by one, the rest of her family approached, enveloping her in a group hug that spoke volumes about their acceptance and love. As the initial emotions subsided, Martina stood to face her wife, Sarah. There was a moment of hesitation between them, years of shared history, and the weight of recent revelations hanging in the air. Sarah reached out, gently touching Martina's face. "I missed you," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so glad you're home." The days and weeks that followed were a period of adjustment for everyone. Martina worked with her lawyers to clear up the legal issues surrounding her mistaken deportation, a process that shed light on flaws in the system and garnered some media attention. At home, there were long conversations, tears, and moments of confusion, but also laughter and a deepening understanding. Martina's children adapted with the resilience of youth, proudly telling friends about their two moms. Her parents, though initially struggling, found that their love for their child outweighed their preconceptions. Returning to work presented its own challenges. Martina decided to be open about her transition, working with HR to create a plan for coming out to colleagues and clients. While there were some awkward moments and a few lost clients, she was surprised by the overall support she received. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other socials if you want more wonderful content, early access, behind the scenes, and more. All links down below.